Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos with Method, and today I'm going to be ranking melee DPS in Mythic Plus going into patch 8.3. I'm going to cover the strengths and weaknesses of each class, and then give each spec a rating based on a few categories. I'm not going to cover Shaman, Hunter, or Druid in this video. They do have melee specs, but they're mostly played as ranged in Mythic Plus, so to keep this video from getting too long, I'm going to save discussion of those classes for the ranged video, which is coming soon on this channel, by the way, so remember to subscribe. I'll also be mostly talking about the most popular spec for each class, though I will mention when other specs bring unique abilities to the table. My ratings are going to be based on high-level keys on the live servers, but I'll also be sure to mention when specs have advantages or disadvantages on the MDI tournament servers. The first category I'm going to rank classes by is damage. In Mythic Plus, this is mostly weighted towards good AoE, although single target is also relevant and necessary to get a perfect score in this category. This is the most important trait for a damage dealer in Mythic Plus, so it's weighted out of 10 points rather than 5 like the other categories. Utility is a tough word to define. I'm going to use it to mean things that affect your big picture strategic options in a dungeon. So this is things like Shroud of Concealment or crowd control abilities like Imprison that can be used to change how you pull the dungeon. It is also going to include buttons that some specs get that handle specific abilities. So these are things like Dispels, Purges, and even niche abilities like Blessing of Freedom. Anything that means you going into a pull and you have an answer to something that you might otherwise not have an answer to. And for these DPS classes, I'm also going to include any off-healing or group-wide defensive cooldowns in this category. In this video, utility is not going to include stuff that is mostly used on the fly in the middle of a fight. I'm instead creating a different category for these abilities called Mob Control. This is AoE effects like Intimidating Shout and Leg Sweep that stop enemies from casting lethal spells on you or take some pressure off the tank for a moment. It's also single target abilities like Gouge or Hammer of Justice, and this is the category where classes gain bonus points if their interrupt is better than average. Some abilities can score in both Mob Control and Utility, things like Ring of Peace and Death Grip that are uniquely powerful and enable certain pulls but can also be used mid-fight to great effect. The final category is Survivability. Specs score points here based on being able to survive the heavy incoming damage in Mythic Plus. Part of this is having tools for predictable damage, but part of it is also just having panic buttons to hit in case something does go wrong. Before we look at the first class, I'd just like to say that this is my opinion. You might have a different opinion based on your experiences, and if you do, I'd love to hear it in the comments. For any level below the highest keys on the live servers, or the MDI on the tournament realm, the best class for you to play is probably the class that you're the best at, or the class that you enjoy the most. If you want to learn why some classes are more represented than others at the highest levels, this video, though, is my attempt to explain that. So let's start off at number 1 with Rogue. The most common Rogue spec in both MDI and in live keys is Outlaw, although Assassination is also a fantastic spec. Subtlety was unfortunately nerfed into the ground back when patch 8.1 hit, and has never really recovered. Rogue's damage is fantastic. In AoE and single target, they can sustain very high numbers, and Outlaw even got a burst damage cooldown, which is what they were missing, when Blood of the Enemy was added to the game in patch 8.2. Outlaw also doesn't need to be catered to in any way. They're happy fighting any number of targets for any amount of time, unlike some other specs that need to have the group consider their cooldowns and pull around them to be fully effective. Some classes can, under the right circumstances, deal more damage than Rogue, but the very high overall damage that Rogues bring is worth 9 points out of 10 for me. Utility is a huge strength of Rogues. Shroud of Concealment alone is more valuable than the whole kit that some other classes bring. Even with the new Awakened affix allowing groups without Rogues to perform some skips, Shroud remains the gold standard, and I expect MDI keys and the highest keys on the live servers to continue to have Rogues. Sap is also one of 2 abilities in the game that can be used to crowd control enemies without getting in combat. And Vanish can be used to do many skips when Shroud is either on cooldown or when enemies have stealth detection. You can just pull the pack away, parry, cloak, then grapple away and vanish once the group is through, and that lets you do even more skips throughout a dungeon. Rogues are definitely getting the full 5 points from me for utility. Outlaw in particular brings unmatched mob control, especially single target mob control. They don't have any way to interact with multiple enemies at once, but they can stun enemies for long periods of time as part of their damage rotation with Between the Eyes, and they can gouge and blind and vanish into cheap shot. Pretty much any enemy that needs to be stopped from doing something can be stopped by an Outlaw Rogue for a long period of time. Despite not having AoE crowd control, this kit is enough to earn all 5 points for mob control. Survivability is also a strength for rogues. Cloak of Shadows and Riposte are powerful immunities against most magic and physical effects, respectively, and Feint can reduce huge amounts of otherwise lethal AoE damage on bosses like Kragma the Infested, the Soulbound Goliath, and Overseer Korgus. If all else fails, rogues can also talent into Cheat Death, which will save their lives once every 6 minutes, and that will save lives many times over the course of many different dungeons. Vanish also serves as survivability, allowing rogues to stop many casts from even happening on them. So rogues definitely earn all 5 survivability points. This totals up to 24 out of 25 possible points, and from my perspective, there's a good chance that Rogue deserves that 25th point too. Rogue is a powerhouse of Mythic Plus right now, and has been included in basically every top level key this entire expansion, both on the live servers and in the MDI. In fact, double and triple Rogue compositions are far more popular than zero Rogue. This season, the top teams will continue to have a rogue, but the good news for everybody else is that the penalty for not having a rogue will be far less severe, since the Awakened Affix is going to allow you to do skips that Shroud would otherwise be the only way to do effectively. Alright, in second place we have the Demon Hunter. In live keys, Demon Hunters blast damage. Their single target and AoE are both fantastic, and for important big pulls or tough bosses, they have meta, an incredible damage cooldown that also makes them require next to no healing. They also apply Chaos Brand, increasing the entire group's magic damage by 5%, which can be a large amount of damage depending on the rest of the group. In the MDI setting, the long cooldown of meta has not lined up well with how frequent the big pulls are, but in hierarchies on the live servers, the longer and more powerful cooldown is actually more upside than downside. In the live setting, therefore, I'm going to give Demon Hunters the full 10 points for damage. Demon Hunters have a few big points of utility. Imprison is the big one. It's a range CC that allows your group to walk by the imprisoned enemy without getting into combat. Having 1 or 2 such non-combat CCs in the group is a big benefit and allows several annoying packs of 2 enemies to be skipped at the cost of 0 time. Darkness is also a powerful group-wide defensive cooldown, especially against heavy incoming damage from multiple sources. Outside of this, most of the rest of the Demon Hunter kit falls into the categories of mob control and survivability, although the out-of-combat CC alone is enough for me to award 3 points out of 5 for utility. Mob control is definitely a big strength of Demon Hunters. Chaos Nova, Fell Eruption, and an offensive purge, as well as a ranged kick that even gives them damage by giving them some fury of their resource. And the ability to soak certain dodgeable abilities with Blade Dance mean that a well-played Demon Hunter can often handle the abilities of multiple enemies each pull. Demon Hunters can also provide a powerful 70% AoE slow with Vengeful Retreat, which is useful when you need to kite or when you're in some kind of panic situation. Overall, Demon Hunter mob control is just fantastic and earns all 5 of the available points. Survivability is DH's biggest strength in very high keys on the live servers. While in demon form, they leech huge amounts of life and therefore require very little healing, even on throughput-intensive bosses like Galv and Temple. And they have several powerful defensive options. Blur is a 35% damage reduction, that's bigger than most classes get, on a way shorter cooldown than most classes get also. And it gives them a big chance to dodge incoming attacks as well, so if they get threat for some reason, if the tank dies, Demon Hunters are likely to be able to live for a while with Blur. They also have Netherwalk, something they can talent into that is only on a 2-minute cooldown, so a pretty short cooldown for an immunity. And they can dodge a bunch of abilities like Severing Axe in King's Rest or Deadeye Shot from Overseer Korgus and Toldegor just by using Blade Dance, which is an ability that's up every 5 seconds. And during the second after they hit meta, while they're in the air, they're actually immune to most things, and that can be put to very good use in certain situations. Demon Hunters definitely earn all 5 points for survivability. Overall, Demon Hunters have earned 23 out of 25 possible points, and the 2 utility points that they're missing are only because of the existence of powerful things like Shroud of Concealment and Battle Reses that they just don't have. Demon Hunters are fantastic at any keystone level, and I expect to see many of them atop the live key ladder this season, though I think we still won't see many in any MDI-style tournaments due to factors like big pulls happening just more often than meta is up, and the fact that their tankiness is less important against the damage profile of those MDI-style keys. The next class we are going to look at is Death Knight. Both specs of Death Knight look promising this patch. Damage from Frost looks like it'll be high in any sized pull, whereas Unholy's damage is very cooldown dependent, but it does scale quadratically with the number of targets, which means that massive MDI-style pulls equal millions of DPS. With Beguiling gone, big pulls are likely to be back on the menu even on the live keys, so we may start seeing 20 enemies at once, with a Mistweaver using Way of the Crane and Unholy DKs going quadratic, just like we see in the MDI. Neither Frost nor Unholy's specs damage are all upside though. Both are fairly cooldown dependent, and Unholies can be anemic in small pulls. So combining all these factors, I'm going to give Death Knight 8 points out of 10 for damage. DKs bring powerful utility, particularly in the form of Death Grip and a Battle Res. Death Grip makes some pulls a lot safer, and in dungeons like the Motherlode, it even gives you more options by letting you pilot extra mechanized Peacekeepers. Battle Reses are also valuable in Mythic Plus, especially in an MDI setting, where the Engineering Res isn't an option. If Rescue Druids fall a little bit in the metagame share, which is a strong possibility, expect classes like Death Knights to gain, as the Battle Res they bring is now much more valuable. I'm giving DK 4 points out of 5 for utility on the back of these two powerful effects. Death Grip is also very useful in the middle of pulls to help reposition or bring a fleeing enemy back into the group. Death Knights have a single target slow and can talent into a single target stun. Frost can instead choose to talent into an AoE disorient, whereas Unholy can instead choose to talent into an AoE slow, and both of these are powerful and sometimes even better than the stun. Death Knights can use their kick at range, which is often very helpful. So altogether, this kit is strong. It is an ability or two short of earning the full 5 points, so I'm only going to be giving them 4 points for mob control. Survivability is a weakness of the Death Knight. Anti-Magic Shell is fantastic, and they can heal themselves with Death Strikes, but they don't have anything like an immunity or a cheat death, and they often lack the mobility to get away from danger. So I can only give DK 3 points out of 5 for survivability. Death Knight has picked up 19 out of 25 points from me, though Unholy in particular does something unique with their huge damage and big pulls, and that may be priceless this season. Frost is also a strong spec that I wouldn't be surprised to see in live keys, though I'd expect all the DKs in the MDI to be Unholy. The next class we will talk about is the Monk. Windwalker is a spec that does strong damage in a Mythic Plus environment. Their kit starts to work much better when multiple targets get involved, and though their single target is kind of weak in raid, it's received a buff in patch 8.3, and unlike some other specs, they don't have to make many sacrifices to transform into an AoE monster in Mythic Plus. So their single target is actually quite good compared to the weaker single target that other specs tend to put out in their M+ builds. Mystic Touch also increases the group's physical damage by 5%, and most groups do primarily physical damage, so this is a pretty big amount of extra damage. So altogether, this gets Windwalker 9 points out of 10 for damage. Monks bring massive utility in the form of Ring of Peace, which alone is probably worth 3 points on my 5-point scale. This ability can be used for skips, or it can allow you to pull some enemies in a way that would otherwise be impossible. And monks also bring a disease and poison dispel, and they can even reflect some abilities with diffuse magic. They do have a hard CC in paralysis, and they have a couple of other niche points of utility, like Tiger's Lust. So altogether, I'm giving them 4 points out of 5 for utility. Mob Control is another category where Ring of Peace scores some points. It can be used to help a tank kite, or as an AoE crowd control method. Monks also get Leg Sweep, an AoE stun, and they can use paralysis mid-combat in a pinch to interrupt casts. Though they don't have many abilities in this category, the fact that they have those two powerful AoE effects in Leg Sweep and Ring of Peace earns them 4 points out of 5 for me from Mob Control. Survivability is the biggest challenge for Windwalkers. Though they have some defensive cooldowns, they don't have an immunity or a cheat death, and their rotation includes Whirling Dragon Punch, which basically roots them for a few moments while its animation plays. During this time, they are very vulnerable, so Windwalkers need to be more vigilant than most other classes to survive. I'm giving Windwalkers 2 points out of 5 for this category, but this is a spec where player skill is extremely correlated with survival. This totals up to 19 points out of 25 for Windwalker, and I'm confident that we'll see this spec performing well, both in live keys and at any MDI-style tournaments this patch. Especially as Brewmaster perhaps loses some share in the metagame, the monk utility that Windwalker brings may rise in value, though this effect may be offset by the potential rise of Mistweaver. We'll have to see. The next class we will talk about is Warrior. Fury is the spec that has seen the most play from Warriors in Mythic Plus, and it does monstrous damage and scales very well with extra gear as we near the end of the expansion. It does, however, have one big problem. It only hits 5 targets in AoE, so it's basically out of the question in an MDI setting, and if the live key metagame shifts to larger pulls now that Beguiling is gone, that'll also be a problem for Fury. Arms may step in as they don't suffer from a target cap, though their overall damage has been fairly low this expansion, outside of exactly 2 target situations where their sweeping strikes does serious work. I'm also counting Battle Shout in this category where it does add some damage to the group, so overall I'm going to award Warrior 9 points for damage. This high score is for Fury, as I expect it will continue to be the better of the 2 specs and bring very high damage, but I do have to deduct a point for their target cap, and I could see us living in a world where they actually end up being more like a 6 out of 10 if the massive pulls are happening all the time. Utility is basically absent for warriors, at least the way I'm defining it, as big picture abilities that change how you pull the dungeon. Rallying Cry, however, is a notable group-wide defensive, which I do score as utility, and it can help groups through stuff like Kragmaw's Tantrum, or it can be used as a panic button when things are about to go wrong. Most of the Warriors kit falls instead into the mob control category, where Intimidating Shout is a strong AoE ability that can stop some casts, and Stormbolt can be talented into for a stun. I'm giving Warrior 1 point out of 5 for utility and only 3 points for mob control. With their plate armor, Warriors have a lot of natural survivability against incoming physical damage. Fury also has a very powerful defensive in Enraged Regeneration, which often functions as both a 30% damage reduction and a massive source of healing. Arms' defensive swaps out this healing for parrying all incoming attacks, which can also be potent, generally a little bit worse though. Fury has a nice naturally high health pool, and they can talent into a passive 10% damage reduction during Enrage, which has a very high uptime. So even though Warriors don't have an immunity or a cheat death, I'm going to award 4 points for survivability, due to the natural and passive tankiness that they have. In total, Warrior has picked up 17 points out of the 25 available. Fury's massive damage, especially in single target and in small cleave, is very strong, and it's the main factor that leads to groups wanting to play with one in high keys on live servers. Warrior is less likely to be played if small cleave gets replaced by more massive AoE with Awakened, as it already has been in MDI style keys. The final class we're going to cover on this video is Paladin. Retribution Paladins can do big damage in their cooldown, especially in bigger AoE, though their sustained damage can fall behind other classes, especially in single target. As I was mentioning earlier, Beguiling going away may lead to groups going for massive pulls more often this season, which will be great news for Paladins. Vision of Perfection's major power is also receiving a buff, and Paladins are notably the only melee that really uses that essence in Mythic Plus. I do worry though that Paladins will be outscaled by other classes, and that their starting point from the previous season in terms of the amount of damage they're dealing was already a little bit below the other classes, as evidenced by their lack of representation in the MDI, despite the big pulls that I just theorized being good news for them. I'm therefore going to only give Paladins 7 of the 10 points on the table for damage. Paladins have a few nice pieces of utility. Blessing of Wisdom helps healers through tough boss fights, Blessing of Protection can allow DPS players to drop threat, or it can remove bleeds from anyone, and Blessing of Freedom has some niche uses as well. Lay on Hands and Word of Glory also fit into this category. These are two very powerful pieces of off-healing that frequently save lives in high keys. Pallies also have a Poison and a Disease Dispel, so these effects all combine to be worth 4 points out of 5 for me. It's a lot of utility. Paladins also bring a couple of strong pieces of mob control. Hammer of Justice as a nice, long, single-target stun on demand is very nice, and they'll usually talent into Blinding Light as an AoE disorient in Mythic Plus. Though these are both strong abilities, there are only 2 of them, so I am only giving Paladin 2 points for mob control. Survivability is a Paladin's strength. They have an immunity in Divine Shield, though it's on a long cooldown. And even though I counted Word of Glory, Lay on Hands, and Blessing of Protection for the utility they bring when cast on others, it's also worth noting that the Paladin can use these to save themselves in a heartbeat. They can also cast a large Absorb Shield on themselves with Shield of Vengeance. This, combined with the natural tankiness of the plate armor they wear, earns Paladins 4 points out of 5 for survivability. Overall, Paladins have picked up 17 points out of 25. Like Warrior, I wouldn't be surprised to see this spec in high keys, especially if their damage ramps up nicely this tier. Their abilities tend to translate worse to an MDI setting, so I'd probably still be surprised to see them make their way deep into those types of tournament. So let's take a look at all 6 of these melee classes together. A few things are jumping out to me here. First of all, there are a few specs really pushing the limits of my scoring system. It's hard to find anything wrong with Rogues and Demon Hunters. They just do so well in Mythic Plus. Though all of these melee classes do actually have a nice high rating here. Part of this is due to how well suited melee are to BFA dungeons in general. There are a lot of interrupts and pseudo-interrupts required, so that tests mob control, and melee classes tend to have more ways to do this than ranged ones. Melee classes also tend to have the ability to start doing damage on demand without relying on cooldowns or setup, which has scored them more points on damage and serves them well this expansion. I expect to see Demon Hunters and Rogues in most of the top live key runs this season, and Rogues, Death Knights, and Windwalkers taking the lion's share of the MDI DPS slots. The other melee specs will do fine in live keys also, and in general, I think the trend of most groups having either 2 or 3 melee DPS will continue until the end of the expansion. As I said at the start of the video, however, this video is my opinion based on my experiences and the information I have. Your opinions may of course be different, and I'd love to hear them in the comments. Also note that below the highest levels of keys, player skill generally outweighs the class that they play. So unless you're planning on competing in the MDI or pushing some world first keys, this video is meant to be educational and entertaining, rather than telling you which players to invite and which to decline. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel for all the rest of the roles, and check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Dratnos, where I make all sorts of Mythic Plus focused content. Thanks everybody for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.